Okay. Okay, so I'll get started. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to my TED Talk. So I wonder if I can hide this. There we go. So I'm going to be talking today about the Kensington Expressway Project. It's definitely gotten a lot of publicity over the past few weeks. There's a ton of different opinions flying around about it. Some of those opinions are well-informed and identify specific things about the project. Other ones are more kind of what I might define as like political statements about kind of the goals and ideas for what is driving this thing versus what the ideal solution might be. So I'm going to try and present as unbiasedly as I can. I have very strong opinions about this. I've been trying to fight this out with a lot of people in my community, a lot of people who I would think of as people who kind of ally politically with me in Buffalo matters. But my goal today is to just give you like an unbiased, kind of even-handed view of what's happening, and with the goal of giving you the ability to make informed comments. The comment period for this project for the first environmental impact statement draft is on Friday. So kind of today and tomorrow are sort of the last days to submit comments. And I really want everybody here to be able to comment if they'd like to, regardless of what their opinion on the actual topic is. So in order to kind of dive into what the project is, I really need to give you a comprehensive look at what the Humbodlt Parkway was and what it is now. This quote from Martin Luther King was spoken at the Faith Baptist Church on Humbodlt Parkway in 1959. And a lot of what he's talking about here is sort of the idea of the public officials kind of disregarding and being kind of the obstructionists in regards to ending segregation. And as he was saying these words, the project to remove the Humbodlt Parkway on which this church stood and stands was already underway. As many of you know, the original Olmsted design for the park system in Buffalo connected individual nodes, all kind of in a network of parkways with the Delaware Park that was sort of the beating green heart of the park system in Buffalo. What's identified here as the parade is the original title for what is now MLK Park on the east side of Buffalo. So you can see that there's while the west side has Bidwell, Chapin, Soldier Circle, Lincoln Parkway, and what he calls the lake here. The east side really has MLK Park and then this long stretch of green that connects MLK Park to what is still Delaware Park. The actual median of the parkway for Humbodlt Parkway was about double the size of what is now on Chapin and Bidwell. So it was a much more substantial amount of trees, much more substantial amount of green space. The fabric of the east side is very much built or intended to be built with this parkway still there. And a lot of the east side development, including my own neighborhood of Hamlin Park, here is the existing Chapin, Bidwell, and Lincoln Parkways that kind of give you a sense of what Humbodlt really was intending to be, except a bigger version of it. This quote from Mark Goldman identifies that this was a very active parkway. There was a lot of public space, a lot of community spaces that were directly connected to the parkway. And as I started to indicate, a lot of the east side was developed, including my neighborhood of Hamlin Park, was developed as an urban suburb. And you can see on this aerial over here, a lot of the properties are much smaller than they would be on a suburban lot because they don't really anticipate the need for a front yard or a backyard the same way suburban properties do, because it had this parkway going through it, and that was sort of everybody's front yard. So what is the parkway now? Well, there was a sustained effort for over 2 decades to try and get rid of the parkway, basically. There isn't really a way of describing it that's not kind of violent, chaotic, and really, I don't know, in retrospect, kind of mean-spirited. So there was this quote from Mike Puma here. Mike Puma wrote the historic preservation report that makes Hamlin Park a historic neighborhood in Buffalo. And he identifies that there are a lot of different factors that led to kind of the white flight out of Buffalo, but it was really a chicken and eggs thing. There was an effort to kind of move out of the city of Buffalo or move out of the East Side, and young African-American professionals being able to now afford property often moved into those neighborhoods. And then it sort of was a snowball running downhill effect. There was more white flight because more Black people were moving in. It was kind of, like I said, a chicken and egg scenario. A lot of the families that were living on the east side of Buffalo at the time were Polish, German, and Jewish. Those were kind of the communities that popped up there. And then those were the same communities that started to move out towards Cheektowaga as white flight was kind of taking the city hold. And there was always this desire to, okay, now all of our employees in downtown Buffalo are now out in the suburbs here. How do we connect them back to downtown? So because a lot of those families had left the east side already, there was sort of this idea that Humboldt was kind of wasted on this majority Black population that was now occupying the east side. Many of the people who were moving in at the time did not know about the parkway's imminent destruction, and I'll show you some examples of that in a second. But the parkway was identified as this perfect thoroughfare to get people from basically Cheektowaga to downtown as quickly as possible. So the destruction of Humboldt Parkway started off with the cutting down of all of the trees there, then a kind of systemic digging of a trench all the way from Delaware Park all the way down towards what's now the Science Museum. And so obviously a lot is made of this long linear stretch of the parkway that got turned into a throughway. But in addition, there's this connection that, to Delaware Park that was also severed. And this is just one example, although it might be the most severe, of neighborhoods getting completely cut off from each other as part of this intervention. Here is Hamlin Park. With Canisius College at its center here. And over here is a small neighborhood called Trinidad. Trinidad was always its own kind of neighborhood, even when the parkway was there. But now the only way to access Trinidad, apart from Main Street, is the throughway. So I know people over here that have to get on a throughway ramp, then go back against traffic. So this is still a one-way over here, but they have to turn down the one-way in order to get to their houses over here. There is no pedestrian or vehicular way to get from here to here that doesn't involve you going all the way up and around. So Trinidad is really a neighborhood that was a casualty of this work. So I mentioned that, there's more to it than just the kind of like the facts about what happened. There's a lot of, feelings about what happened that matter as well. This is so this is a video clip of Robert Trainum Coles, who was one of the only Black architects in Buffalo at the time. Many of you might know him because he talked at UB a couple of times. I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but his house is only a couple blocks away, or his old house is only a couple blocks away from my own.
The trees were being cut in the block.
One here.
5 acres of
client Warren Park for what we're now.
Hold on, sorry about that. Let me reopen that.
By the time we learned what was happening, it was too late. The plans were drawn, the reality was there, and it was too late to do anything. I mean, when I say too late, there was this movement, which was the no overhead transit movement, that wanted the trains to run underground all the way out to UB. And they were successful in a certain way in that the transit was along Main Street.
I think I pulled up the wrong clip. I'm sorry, but just to summarize what he says, he indicates that when he moved there and purchased his property there, he already knew of the imminent destruction of the parkway, and he tried to organize his neighbors in order to let them know what was going to happen to this parkway. And he was trying to show them exactly how much of the parkway was going to get taken up. He was trying to explain that all of the trees would be gone. And his neighbors responded with, "That's not what the man downtown told me." And then it wasn't until the next door trees were getting cut down that they started to organize. And his response was, "Well, it's too late now." In addition, there's just regular residents that experience the destruction of Humbodlt as well. This is a clip from my neighbor and friend Maxine.
My name is Maxine Hall. I moved on Brunswick Boulevard in 1957, I believe it was. My mother purchased a house on Brunswick after my father died. I was not really too much aware. I knew the Humbodlt Park was where it was because we used to go visit someone on the other side of the street, and we used to walk through the park, up and down, and you could kind of sit around and have like a little picnic sometimes in the park. And once it changed over, it was a shock to everyone. It was uncomfortable, and I knew the reason why it happened. And when it did happen, the different blacks, as well as my mom, who had bought property on Brunswick, they bought it from the Jewish community, and they knew about the expressway coming through. That's why they made a decision to sell the property. So they sold the property mainly to blacks, and the blacks moved in and the whites moved out. So that was the changeover from the Hamlin Park to the expressway.
And for those of you, I know it was a little difficult to hear, she was identifying that the communities that were selling the houses to the primarily black residents that were moving in, they were aware that the expressway was moving in. And whether or not that's true or how well that information was disseminated, it really doesn't matter. The feeling in these neighborhoods is that this parkway was stolen from them. And there was no advance warning on their part from them being for them to have the understanding of what was happening. So this is the reality that we live in now, where we basically have a pollution-filled trench cutting through the east side of Buffalo, and the impacts of this cannot really be overstated. The trench cuts through and cuts off many parts of the community. There's moments to cross over is limited to these intermediary bridges and pedestrian bridges that I straight up have never seen anybody use the pedestrian bridges before in my entire time on the east side. They're just completely unused, more of a gesture than anything. And the impacts of this are completely dire. This is a map of home values in the Buffalo area. And you can see it has affected the entirety of the east side, and rightfully so. There's a pollution-filled trench cutting through half of the city. And therefore, you could really see the impacts here just from the other side of Main Street. This is Cold Springs here. Again, it's not a neighborhood that's dissimilar in form or function from anything that happens over here, yet it's bright green here and dark red there. And here's just a view of one of the areas on one side of the park, or one side of the expressway to the other. Just demonstrating how difficult it is to try and navigate. If you live over here, and I know many people that this is the situation, they live on one side, work on the other, et cetera, or vice versa. And the inconvenience to day-to-day life, not to mention the fact that you're kind of sucking down pollution when you're trying to navigate across it, is really, really uncomfortable. So almost immediately after the destruction of the parkway, and probably even during the destruction of the parkway, there was community efforts led from within the east side to try and mitigate the damage. In the early 70s, the Restore Our Communities Coalition was formed, and they were meeting at this small farmhouse. It's actually across the street from my house on Headley Place. And trying to organize not necessarily a restoration of the parkway, but a way that they could sell some restoration to happen on the east side. And it wasn't meant to be a complete fix for everything that happened. However, they were trying to get something done. So their effort was made, or their efforts were primarily on practical solutions that they could implement. I first got acquainted with the folks at ROC in 2015 while they were shopping around this presentation called Mission Possible. And again, I'm just emphasizing the possible part of it was really a factor in what they were proposing and how they were going about it. The plan to cap the expressway was developed in the 1970s by Clark Eaton, who was a East Side resident. That is basically the plan that the DOT is proposing now. It's more or less the same thing. And there's been community leadership that has praised the Restore Our Communities Coalition. I'm just going to call them ROC from here on out because that's how we normally talk about them. So the Trinidad Neighborhood Association Block Club's been a huge supporter of ROC and their mission to try and get something done on the east side. Keeping in mind, when you see the DOT proposal, it does not fix the situation at Trinidad. They're just a supporter of anything happening. And then this quote from Brad Wales, who many of you know from as a professor at UB, a member of the East Side Parkways Coalition, calling ROC heroes for being able to secure $1 billion from the DOT in order to get anything to happen. And something somehow did end up happening. They got some traction from some national figures. This is Stephanie Barber Jeter, who's the head of our neighborhood association with Chuck Schumer. She's also the head of ROC. I don't actually know if she's the official head of ROC, but she's the head of ROC. This funding that's coming through the state is solely due to ROC's interfacing with the DOT and state officials, really putting the pressure on, and then also leveraging, Stephanie said to me one time, politics is just never letting a good crisis go to waste. And when the top shooting happened, they decided that was the moment they were going to seize on to really put pressure on politicians to make something happen. There was involvement from the federal government and the White House regarding this action. Stephanie ended up visiting the White House, I think, for 2 days, which is insane. Secretary Mayor Pete is here with Chuck Schumer and Kathy Hochul in the background, talking about how beneficial this cap would be. So let's talk about the cap. Let's talk about the concept of it, where it comes from. It's more or less a American move in the kind of like, well, we're not ready to be done with roads, so how do we make this work kind of movement. The DOT proposal identifies this area basically. So this is Ferry here and Sydney Street cutting over to Brunswick here. That's the extent of the cap that's being proposed. And this is just the north part of it. This is the southern part of it as you get towards the Science Museum. This is the Science Museum Magnet School right here. And then MLK Park is right here. So it kind of takes the back third of the original parkway and tries to kind of mitigate the issues there. And then this area here, which was never a park, that was the Olmsted design, is sort of just going to be converted to generic green space. I think these are supposed to be benches here, but I do know that Rock really opposes the benches. I will get into why when we get to the opinion portion of my presentation. This is a proposed roundabout at Best Street that would basically mitigate the crossing of the thruway there. So some observant, some of you who are observant might notice that there is no proposed ventilation for this cap depicted in any of the plans. This is actually a ventilation structure that was designed for the Big Dig. This is, I think, one of 4 ventilation hubs that the Big Dig has that sucks fresh air down into the tunnel and expels polluted air out. There is no proposed ventilation for the DOT proposal. And that is actually what they indicate as a selling point of it. Kind of changing gears here to the sort of larger national movement. This article by Sam Brash talks about a park that's similar in Colorado that bridges 2 communities that were separated by a thruway with a park, and talks about how the exhaust fumes being directly underneath the park might not be the greatest benefit to people that live in the park. They're still sucking down polluted air. They're still exposed to a lot of the particulate matter that gets expelled just from, rubber tires and things like that. And this article is really being cited by a lot of the people who oppose, we'll get into the opposition in a second, but the people who oppose this project wholesale identify this article as one of the reasons why they oppose it. And they do in this article test what the impacts of pollution are at the park, at the ends of this tunnel, as well as in the communities adjacent to it. And they anecdotally, not scientifically, anecdotally found that there is not a significant difference from the park to the adjacent communities. And furthermore, they identify later on in the article that the Buffalo cap is something that might work better than this Colorado cap because of its length, because you're capturing more pollution inside, you're not expelling as much on the exterior, and the fact that you lack ventilation might be a plus to the communities that are close to the cap. So if you're at Ferry, for example, you're going to be getting less pollution than you are right now.
It's the air trapped in.
It's complicated. We're going to get into it right now. So this is a proposed cross section of the cap. You can see that there is these jet fans, not Jets fans, but jet fans on the top of the tunnel. And they have this plan that there's going to be these sensors that are going to detect emissions within the tunnel. The fans will be inactive most of the time. And when those sensors pick up that there's too much emissions in there, the fans turn on and it sucks fresh air in from one end of the tunnel and blows out the polluted air at the end of the tunnel. Some of you might be thinking that, oh, well, what happens? We'll get there. Right now, This is the plume diagrams for where the polluted air is now and versus where they anticipate it being with the cap in place. So you can see how good the DOT is at selling shit. This is worse. This is worse here. It's better in the middle, but it's not better at the ends. And the fact that, Hamlin Park School is right here, right near the end of the tunnel here. The magnet school is literally at the end of the tunnel. MLK Park, where there's kids playing basketball roughly 24 hours a day, are right at the end of that tunnel as well. And then they did this kind of clever thing where they projected it out to anticipate electric cars being more prominent in 2027. So you can see that a lot of the emissions are less than they were before, but still it's worse with the cap at the ends than in the middle. So now that we know what some of the problems are with the DOT proposal, let's look at what the opposition is saying about the proposal itself. So I'm saying the opposition, this is not necessarily a collective group, although there is a collective group that has organized an opposition to it. But this is mostly just general public thought and some influencing opinions that are talking about the proposal. Beth Downing, who was at the time the interim executive director of the Olmsted Conservancy, identified how short-sighted it is to look at the restoration of this parkway as a throughway project, that the funds could be better directed towards full parkway restoration, and they could totally avoid a lot of the air quality issues as a part of that. Notice that it does not identify what would happen to the rest of the 33. But again, this is the Olmsted Conservancy. Their job should be conserving Olmsted. I think this is an entirely valid opinion to have. Mark Summer talked about kind of the general opposition feel in a recent article for the Buffalo News as sort of the angst that the Hochul administration is unwilling to even explore the possibility of a full parkway restoration in lieu of this tunnel and cap situation. The DOT has firmly ruled out that is like a full parkway restoration is not within the scope of this project. It is not what this money is supposed to be being used for. And so they can't really explore what that impacts of that would be. And this is a quote, it's a quote from that same Buffalo News article, but it's a quote from Brad Wales identifying a very real problem with the sort of DOT's PR statement that this is just phase one. This cap will be in place and then we could potentially expand it further north. Brad very perceptively identifies one of the problems with that, which is the Skagwada Creek. I haven't talked about the Skagwada Creek or really the Skagwada Expressway at all in this presentation, but I will try not to get into it too much here. But the creek goes into a culvert at the end of Forest Lawn here. It is underground all the way to Cheektowaga. So all of this creek here is no longer actually a creek. It's a culvert underground, and the subway system is actually underneath that culvert, which is why one of the reasons why if you ever get off at the Delavan stop of the metro, the walls are just kind of always wet. The concrete's always kind of like sweating. It's because it's underneath a creek. And the idea of pushing a tunnel further north has some problems. There's a creek in the way. So what do we do about that? And Brad is saying that because of that problem, it cements the road cutting through the east side forever, this tunnel project. And of various other community leaders, I'm going to read these quotes. This one's from Matt Deering, who was a candidate for the Ellicott District Common Council. He says, fully undoing the myriad of wrongs visited on the east side will take generations, but giving back a Humbodlt Parkway could be done in a matter of months. and the savings could be used to construct rapid transit and further reduce traffic. And this quote is from Candace Moppins, who I identify here as being part of the East Side Parkways Coalition. I'm not exactly sure if she's a member, but she's a reason why it was founded. She's the executive director of the Delvin Grider Community Center, which is like our neighborhood community center down Delavan. And she says, why not just fill the highway in? That would solve the air quality, reconnect the community, and foster something that in my lifetime that we've never had it experienced on Humbodlt Parkway. We have the opportunity to get it right, and we should get it right. So now what? I put this rendering in here because the DOT put it in here, and I have a fascination with things that, like, why is this a rendering? Like, I don't really know. Like, I know what a road looks like, so I don't know why I need this, but anyway. So the draft environmental impact statement for this project has been issued. The comment period ends November 10th, and I hope that basically the preceding information is enough for you to make an informed comment either way, no matter what your opinion on the project is. If you think the cap is a great idea, you should have the knowledge and foreknowledge, or the knowledge to be able to make an informed comment on things that you'd like to see improved. If you think that it's a terrible idea and you'd rather see a full parkway restoration, you have the freedom and ability to comment as such. And that is the end of my unbiased portion of this presentation. But if you would like to know what I think Maxine is 80 years old, and she doesn't have time for us to pontificate about the future of cars and highways in Buffalo. The parkway was stolen from her, not us. And it's not stolen from Brad Wales, and it's not stolen from Matt Deering. It was stolen from her and her family is all dead. There's only one chance to make this right, and it's right now. I agree with Candace Moppins that we have the chance to get this right. Let's get it right. It doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be right. We also need to remember what state we live in. Everything in this state, this whole branch of all these agencies, including the Department of Transportation, whose court this project is in, is under the control of our God King Pharaoh, Governor of New York, Kathy Hochul. And Kathy Hochul, you may know, just barely won her governorship against against a Republican challenger, and she very narrowly lost that because of a lack of suburban support. So she is not going to change her mind about getting these suburbanites commutes to be lengthened, giving them an extra 5 minutes a day to think about how much they hate Kathy Hochul. It's just not going to happen. And I'll also remind you that Kathy Hochul is from Hamburg, a suburb of Buffalo that very much is dependent on a throughway cutting to downtown. And speaking of the suburbs, the 33 in its inception and now is about the suburbs and downtown. A cap now will not stop them from getting rid of the throughway if either of those two parties agree to get rid of the throughway. When those parties agree to get rid of the throughway, if they ever agree to get rid of the throughway, it'll be gone regardless of what the East Side wants. We just are along for the ride, pun intended. And finally, I'm going to go back to that quote from Matt Deering, and I don't intend to be mean about this because I know Matt. I like him. I would have voted for him if I was in Ellicott District. This idea that a opposition to the cap equals getting a full parkway is very frustrating to me. The fact that he says a matter of months here, I'm talking to a group of design professionals that have been working on, some of you, the same projects for the state of New York for years. Why would it be done in a matter of months? Why would they piss off the suburbs that quick? And I'm going to come back to this. There's another clip from the Robert Coles interview that I'd like to play. But I just want to go to this flow chart of opinions here. I kind of just think that an opposition to the cap is basically going to maintain and cement things as they are for the foreseeable future. Just today or yesterday, WGRZ article came out written by Nate Benson, identifying that both the Hochul administration and the DOT said that if this project is opposed, this $1 billion just goes to the next city on the list. It doesn't get spent throughout the east side. It doesn't get redistributed as a wealth redistribution. It doesn't go to parks. It doesn't go to rapid transit, as again, not to pick on Matt, but as he identified in that quote, it just goes away and nothing gets better. But I'm really, really concerned with this. So if you care to know what I will be commenting on the draft environmental impact statement for the 33, I would like to see the cap extended to Best Street. This little overlap here would help a ton with the air quality over here. I would like to study the impacts of adding stacks to the center of this thing to help mitigate the amount of pollution that happens at the ends. Does if we poke a hole right here and get rid of some of the exhaust 3 stories up above residences, does it mitigate that? We don't know. And finally, the design cost is cheap. Just figure out what you're going to do with the Scajaquada now. And it doesn't have to be built part of the project. You don't have to move it out of the way as part of this cap. But what are we going to do about it in the future? That would help the argument that you're not trying to cement this throughway for everybody's future and children's lifetimes. And that's it. I'd like to open it up for further discussion, and everybody who has an opinion or question, please feel free to ask. But most importantly, if you do have thoughts on this, please, even if they disagree with my own, please submit a public comment to the DOT by Friday. Thank you.
Now, the $1 billion that's been allocated.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know, is that, where did that come from?
It's such a good question, Emma. The short answer is I don't know.
Okay.
It's hard to find out. Even I know that Rock has told me that the throughway funding that's being used for this was part of a bill passed under the Obama administration. So this money is earmarked statewide to use for transportation, period. Again, that's what they're saying. I don't know for sure if that's true or not. I know that $50-some million is coming from the federal government, and that would absolutely go away. But again, that's a very small potatoes, in comparison to the rest of it. So I don't know, but they have held pat that it is for this project and this project only. And if we don't get it, it goes to either another city in New York, another town in New York, whatever. Maybe it just goes to more throughway rest stops that we all know and love.
How much of the original parkway does this represent?
About a third. It's and I will, to build on that exact question, there's a lot of communities that wouldn't be served by a restoration necessarily as a cap, because down over here by the Fruit Belt, Willard Park, those communities, they'll still have a throughway cutting through them with no parkway involved. So I am sympathetic to that for sure. But yeah, the full the restoration of it would be about a third of the parkway. And I'll also say, just to be completely honest about what the DOT's proposal is, the amount of soil that they could feasibly have there is about 3 feet, which limits the amount of height of trees that can grow there as well. They'll still be relatively tall, but it would be more akin to like what you see on a new street, as opposed to the old oaks that you saw cut down on the old parkway. So many tree enthusiasts would say it restores zero amount of the parkway, but it attempts to restore a third.
Just to be billion or?
It's gone up a few different times. So the 2018 projection that the DOT put forth, and again, DOT has a lot of these things in concept that never see the light of day. That was identifying, I think, 600 million. And then the most recent projections that I've seen were about 900 million. And the 1.2 billion that gets thrown around includes the all-in soft costs, design fees, permits, that kind of thing, all the temporary roads that would need to occur. And then additionally, to mitigate the additional traffic that would happen on the adjacent streets while this construction is going on, it now includes full sidewalk and street restoration on all those streets with like additional tree plantings and stuff. So that whole thing is being cited as costing 1.2 billion. But this is New York State. They're not opposed to spending the same dollar 2 or 3 times. So
the Kensington low enough to pretty much cap right over top, or they got to dig deeper?
They do have to dig deeper in a few spots.
So is there any like infrastructure upgrade
Yes.
with that?
Yeah. So the right now the residents there call it the bathtub, and it's in bad shape. So reconstructing parts of the thruway are pretty much necessary anyway. And the cap is sort of icing on the cake.
DOT is asking people to comment, but like who ultimately makes the decision? Like, comments actually going to have any impact? Or?
I'm going to go back to that org chart I showed about New York State. It's really just our God, Pharaoh, King, Emperor, Governor of New York. And whoever that is, I'm not picking on Kathy Hochul here. That's how our state is structured. So, yeah, they have sometimes to their benefit, other times to their huge not benefit. The DOT has pretty much ignored public comment as far as this goes. The difference with the environmental impact statement is that they have to respond to every single comment. So that is kind of the only chance where you're going to get a real answer. And their answers that I've seen so far, the ones that have come into public comments in the past, have been pretty canned. If you're going to ask, you should restore the full parkway and fill in the throughway, they will say that is not in the scope of this project. And it's very cut and dry, is simple as they can make it. And it's not dissimilar how we would respond to a comment that we aren't contractually obligated to. The person might have a good idea, a perfectly valid opinion. We're talking about like an engineer at DOT here. They don't really have any responsibility to answer. How dare you put cars in my neighborhood? They're like, I'm doing my job. Yeah.
For anybody else too. I'm wondering, it seems like there's maybe 2 different aspects of this they talked about as problems.
Mm-hmm.
One being that, the 33 took away parks green space from a community. The other, which may not be the same thing though, is also that cut off neighborhood.
Yes.
So you have one, which is a lack of green space.
Mm-hmm.
Another areas of the city.
Right.
Is this intended to only address the one, which is the lack of green space? And then inherently within that 1/3 of the parkway stretch, you get connectivity.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering is, as we talk about how the limitations of a third of this, vary down to MLK, could it be expanded to resolve the connectivity issue? And, to the extent of what's realistically the green space that will be utilized.
Yeah.
I've driven down Lincoln or Chapin many times.
Mm-hmm.
Every once in a while, you see somebody walking their dog.
Yeah.
And those are beautiful parkways,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it seems very underutilized.
Yeah.
So it's kind of in my mind, a 2-part thing.
Yeah.
Connectivity being one, and could you use that dollar amount to start to quite literally bridge across the tunnel?
Yeah.
Or is it more important to reestablish that green space in a tighter geographic area?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will say, and obviously anybody else can jump in as well, because this is really a what do you value kind of question, right? But the DOT studied early on what just more pedestrian bridges and roads would cost. I get the impression when I read those reports that the deck is kind of stacked, you know, when you write a report with 6 different options and one of them's do nothing. And like, you're kind of like, you're going to pick the most expensive one. So just like, let's not really suss out the rest of them. One of them even, I was proposing to just fill in the throughway and put a new throughway at surface grade to better connect to communities, I guess. Pretty much, yeah. That's what the 198 is. So the connecting communities is a goal of this sort of cap and cover movement. That is sort of the original sin that it's trying to correct. The green space in this case is community driven. It's what Rock wanted, because they are nostalgic, and I don't mean that derisively. They're nostalgic about the Parkway. The green space and lack of the green space throughout the east side, to me, speaks to a social infrastructure problem. There isn't a lot of places where people, especially kids, can go that they're just not like illegal somehow, like loitering, or they're in a library, they're causing a disturbance. They're, you know, and many of you guys went to the Canon event, the you know, sustainability symposium down there. How many children were just in the street, like all over the place? They closed all the libraries, they close all the parks, they chain off every public space that they can, and then they're surprised when the kids are fighting in the street. Like, where do you expect them to go? So I think that the social fabric of a parkway on the east side would be more utilized than something on the west side, because the west side has those assets already, in my opinion. So I obviously, I think it's both, but I think I almost would rather the green space just exist as instead of the throughway, or on top of the throughway, whatever you can do in order to kind of give that social infrastructure back.
Scott, for that 1/3 that we're focused on here, based on your involvement with the project and maybe some of your friends and neighbors, I would expect there's almost universal approval for this plan for those residents, but are there pockets of resistance within this community? And
yes.
What are there?
There are absolutely pockets of resistance. I would say, I would more call it, there are pockets of approval, honestly. And I think that that's attributed to a couple of things. I think the DOT has done a piss poor job of communicating this to residents and people around. There are people who go to these public meetings saying, I live, you know, on Humbodlt right there. What's going to happen to my basement? What's going to happen when you're blowing, you know, up the wall there and stuff like that? All these are valid questions when those things haven't been communicated to the residents. Now, I think in the long run, they will more appreciate this parkway being there than the throughway. However, the lack of communication, the lack of rigor on the part of DOT, and to be honest with you, if I'm being fair about it, Rock's complacency. They kind of felt like, we've been working on this thing for 40 years. It's happening now. We can take our foot off the gas. And they're losing ground right now to the opposition, who is vehemently opposed, or they're not vehemently opposed to the project so much as they want a real parkway, and they're conflating those two things. So I think to a lot of East Side residents, and I'm not trying to be, I don't know, I'm not trying to say that the reason why they're opposed is they're ignorant about the project, but I do think ignorance about the project contributes hugely to the public perception about it within the East Side and through Buffalo at large. There's really a thought that if we oppose this, we'll get a parkway later. And it's, in my opinion, just not true. With the parkway, restoration is just as likely today as it would be in 10 years with the cap as it would be with 10 years without the cap, in my opinion.
Have they looked at like long-term studies of this? Like, have they come up with like a sort of timeline for like materials? Like, I just think like you talk about the trees, like, you know, depending on what type of trees they plant, at some point they'll become too big, or they just won't plant trees that will become that big. But like, just long-term, like looking at when the materials for this start to disintegrate or fall into disrepair, like, have they looked at their plans for when that happens? Like, maybe that's when they look at restoring a full parkway, or?
There, to my knowledge, has been none of those studies.
Yeah.
I don't think that the DOT is really in the game of projecting things out to like, well, what happens if we don't intervene over the next 50 years? They redo roads every 5-10 years, so they don't really think about things like that. I will say what they mostly think about is like phasing and like, what do we do when and where does the traffic go and what happens? They're very much engineers in that way. And I'm not trying to be pejorative towards engineers either. It's like, they're looking at this thing and how do we get this thing built? Whereas, you know, I'm hopeful, maybe not. I'm hopeful that there's somebody at Labella thinking about that stuff. I don't really know if there is or not.
Is there any thought on what happens at the end of the belt?
Mhm.
Like, what happens to those dark spots where we saw in those heat maps? That's where
Right
the
now-
pollution concentration-
Right now, nothing. And the DOT's contention is that our hands are tied because even with the added concentration of pollutants, it's still under the federal limit for what they have to treat. So it's a taxpayer dollar thing. Like, they can't just voluntarily add filtration or added ventilation without the federal regulation telling them they have to, I guess, or at least that's their excuse. So their logic is, yes, it's a little worse at those plumes, but overall it's better. And even with the worse particulate matter, it's still considered federally safe.
If the center strip would actually be declared as a park, or would it still be declared as a roadway? Because I'm just thinking in terms of like community involvement. Like, I don't know the regulations on where you can have events. Like, if you're thinking about like a pop-up farmer's market, that probably has to be in like an official park.
Those happen on Bidwell all the time, and it would probably be zoned similarly. I will say that, and I mentioned I was going to get back to the benches thing. There are very old school thoughts about what this park is and could be. And when I say old school, I mean like, I've literally been in meetings where people are saying, well, some of this has to be a parking lot because how are people going to park and go to the park? And I've heard people say, we can't have benches because, and again, I'm quoting, when African Americans see benches, they think that's a place to hang out. And again, the person who said that to me was Black. This is like the old school thought process that people have when they're looking at this thing. And I can't help but try and reach out to these folks who are opposing it, whose hearts are absolutely in the right place, thinking, you guys should be in that conversation with me. I need backup to talk to these people and be like, you can't have parking spaces there. Done, right? We need benches. People need a place to hang out. Done, right? Instead, the energy is being spent on opposing the project, and I find that personally very frustrating.
What's the construction time?
They want to begin mobilizing construction at the end of next year.
How long is it?
they think about 5 years total. That includes the side street restoration as well, which will happen last. So I think that's probably a year and a half on that timeline. And I'm actually pretty hopeful that that timeline would be fairly realistic, because once the state gets moving on something like that, and again, you're involving like suburban inconvenience at that point, they're gonna accelerate things. And again, that kind of goes to the follow through. Who's gonna determine, or who's gonna watch them and say, you can't turn this over when it's just all dirt, right? You're not done until you finish the trees and finish the plantings and curbs and all that stuff.
So where do the cars go? Maybe you said this already, but where do the cars go when it's under construction?
There is a traffic mitigation plan. I don't know. A lot of it goes to Genesee, because there's going to be a detour towards Genesee from a lot of the people that are coming from Cheektowaga. And then some of the traffic will be redirected to Jefferson and other side streets that are adjacent and running parallel with the 33. And then it'll pick back up over here. It'll redirect back in so that everyone gets downtown the same way they've always done. But this hiccup in the middle, they'll take it to the side streets. The people who are overlooking the parkway, no, the plan is that they will be disturbed so little by the construction that they won't have to do anything there. In fact, one of the things that Rock thinks is a gold star on this project is that it affects 0 houses.
I'm a resident in the area. I mean, what would you think about the idea of Humbodlt, on both sides of having a dramatically reduced speed limit? Well, talk about it being more of a parkland green space.
Yeah.
I'd be worried about it being bordered on 30 equals 40.
Yeah.
Mile an hour cars that can pass.
100%.
So I mean, could it be reduced like a school zone?
Yeah.
Or 15 or 20 miles an hour.
Yeah, I think that there's so the Humbodlt Parkway has been decimated over the past 50 years. I mean, just the houses there are, you can like, it's really sad. You can look at them and be like, how beautiful this was, 40 years ago, and how completely degraded it is now because it got purchased by people that don't care about it or whatever. There has been a recent push to form block clubs along Humbodlt. A lot of it has been spurned on by this project, both to voice support and oppose the project, because they're different blocks all the way down. And many of them have been lobbying the city for speed humps down Humbodlt. And that would very much fall in line with what you're talking about to reduce the speed. Speed humps are a very controversial thing if you talk to some people about it. Our street voted it down. I guess you need like 60% of the respondees to say that they want them or something like that. I voted for them because I just kind of felt like we weren't going to get them anyway. So I might as well voice what I think about it, but I don't really care either way necessarily on my own street. But a lot of people feel really strongly about them. They put them on Florida Street, which is a neighborhood street near mine. And I think it works really well. There's, a lot more kids playing outside there.
Yeah, it's really about trying to improve the quality.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you know how many cars travel for 33?
70,000 daily.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. 70,000 on the 33. I can't remember. Our friend Alan presented to us the sustainability group earlier this year, and I believe his identified number on the Skajakoda was 35,000, but that was pre-COVID. And the vast majority of it is that stretch from Parkside to where you enter the 33.
It seems like the state is pretty on board for this plan and
Yeah.
wants to get it done. So is this like asking for comments thing, kind of going through the motions thing from the state?
A little bit.
Would it take kind of like an overwhelmingly like against opinion to make it not happen?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that there are some I think it comes down to elected officials in a lot of contexts, or in a lot of ways. For example, Crystal Peoples-Stokes is one of the most powerful assembly people in all of New York State, and she's the New York Assembly woman for this area. She is adamantly in favor of this solution. I think that for the DOT to take their ball and go home, that would fly in her face and she would throw her weight around to make sure that didn't happen. But having said that, she's an elected official, and if the majority of voters that vote for her don't want this to happen, it's not going to happen. So I think it's in large part a temperature taking on it. And I don't think that, I'm not optimistic that constructive comments are really going to be incorporated at this time. I think that there are elected officials that might not be saying that they are against the cap. One of whom is our mayor right now, but he is against it. And I don't know, I think it's all kind of a game of political football and this comment period. It's number one, it's a legal requirement for a project of this scale that they take the temperature of the community. But I don't know, this is a long way of saying I don't really know how actionable any of the comments are really going to end up being. All we can do is comment and go from there.
Where they have to carry it out in this way, and like you said, be held to like actually finish it instead of just dropping it partway off.
So I don't think that such a contract exists. I think that the same way that a border wall goes away when the next administration doesn't agree with it, this project will go away once we elect a God, Pharaoh, King, Emperor that opposes it. I think that's just how the state works. I'm probably speaking out of turn on that, to be honest. I'm speaking because I know people that have talked to him about it. My understanding is that he thinks the project's dumb. He thinks that it's going to be a pain, and I don't know, probably be president of Buff State by then. So it probably he doesn't really care. But I think that woman, Stephanie Barber Jeter, casts a very big shadow, especially on him. I don't really know what she has on him, but when she says jump, he says how high. And I think that he can't come out against the project in any capacity. And I don't really know how meaningful his opinion would really be on it one way or the other. I don't really think, I don't think, I was surprised too. I don't really understand it from the ground up. I don't understand how you take $1 billion investment and you're like, it's not quite what I want. It's not my favorite thing. Let's do something different. But I think that, the mayor lives on the east side. He lives on the east side where I live, which is barely on the east side. I think that there's a real divide in terms of people's preferences when you cross that Main Street barrier, and the majority of the mayor's supports comes from that side of Main Street. So I think that a lot of it is posturing. He wants to court the west side people more than the east side people, kind of has them in his pocket already. I don't know. I'm speculating. It's all political. And again, he hasn't said anything publicly either way. He also didn't say anything on May 14th when the top shooting happened either. So I don't really think he's in the market of trying to make any political hay right now at all.
I don't think you mentioned acoustics. That seems to be maybe the main benefit that I see from this is, apart from being a green space that could potentially communities. I don't know it, and I don't expect anybody thinks that this is going to be a cure-all for this neighborhood.
Sure.
Has the acoustics been studied at all from capping this?
I do think that both the visual and acoustic impact has a part in that environmental impact study that it's like 300 pages long. There's all sorts of shit in there. But I do think that is in there. I don't know any information about it. But that's a great point. I think that the acoustics have a huge impact on the quality of life in those neighborhoods, probably to a degree that the people don't even realize. You know, a close family friend lived underneath the like in Cheektowaga, underneath the landing zone of the airplanes. And then they ended up doing some work on the runway where they had to change to use the other runway. And like they were like, I didn't even realize how much I heard planes all day. Like, and then when they heard it again, they were like, oh my God, like it was like really jarring. So I think that that's kind of a, I don't know, like there was all this stuff coming out during the pandemic about like Zoom fatigue of like that tiny audio delay when you're in a meeting really taxing and fatiguing you in ways that you don't fully realize. I think it's a really similar kind of thing. So what do you guys think in terms of like taking the temperature here? What do you think should happen to this parkway or to this non-parkway?
Do this.
Do the cap?
Mainly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk about limited depth of soil, which
Mhm.
that's what I'm asking about.
Yeah.
Or whether the green space.
Those are,
Quality of-
yeah. I 100% agree with that, Jim. I worry about the quality of the result as well. And that's part of why I tried to be so personally invested bridging the gap between people who are opposed and people who are in favor, because the people who are in favor, they're very old in general. And they're not going to be around necessarily on the follow through of this thing. The opposition, I know a lot of them very well. I mentioned Brad Wales in this presentation, Matt Deering, India Walton is a member of that group. I really want their support in following through here rather than them taking their ball and going home. And saying, well, they didn't do my favorite solution. So however shitty this turns out, that's just another point in my favor. I'm actually like, that keeps me up at night is exactly what you're talking about. Is like, you know, is this really what we're going to get? And who's going to say whether or not we get it or not? And who's going to fight for it? If all the people who are in favor of it, you know, are asleep at the wheel or don't care enough to voice their opinions on being in favor of benches or you know, not having parking spots on it. Like those are real things that I worry about.
Yeah, I worry about some of also the imagery from, you know, the historic imagery.
Yes.
You know, beautiful elm lines.
Yeah.
Good look by an American elm.
Right. Right.
I think there's a little bit of deception.
Yeah.
Historic imagery.
Yeah.
Especially with elderly residents.
Yep.
Remember that.
Yeah.
I mean, my parents remember, you know, my mom lived in London on Elmwood Park.
Mm-hmm.
And she remembers all the elm trees. And yeah, I think there's like 3 elm trees left.
Yeah.
You know, so as much as a fond memory,
Mm-hmm.
it's just not biologically possible.
Right.
You know?
No, that's a great point.
So those are somewhat concerning. Maybe I'm being cynical.
No, I think you're being appropriately cynical personally. But I share a lot of the same concerns, really do.
But I'm curious about how much this could serve as a catalyst for the neighborhood on either side,
Mm-hmm.
right? For, you talk about lack of green space. Well, there's a lot of green space now as a result of this 33 being built.
Yes.
Right? But we have the potential then to build back, right?
Yeah.
And infill, and then increase the value of this surrounding neighborhood as a result.
Yeah. Let me go back here. So, like, you know, the density that you're seeing here is still desirable among East Side residents, despite the fact that you might think like, oh, like I've got all this green space on the other side of the house. People hate it. And there's been a real push for infill development to happen, irrespective of what happens with the cap, because they want this sort of fabric as part of their lives. So yeah, infill development adjacent to the cap has been really a big push from Habitat for Humanity, who I spoke with at a couple of the public hearings. You know, there's a lot of developers that were, you know, they're East Side based, and they are really excited about the possibility for not only housing and infrastructure, but also business. You know, there's not any businesses on Humbodlt Parkway right now. There's actually right down the street from me, there's a place called Humbodlt Inn. I've never seen it open. But apparently it is a restaurant that's open like 2 or 3 days a week. The impacts of that kind of thing, and not that there's that kind of development happening on Bidwell or Chapin. However, Elmwood is certainly a beneficiary of being able to get a coffee from Cafe Aroma and then go sit in the park, you know?
That, like amending or adding any public bus stops in the proposed area or changing the routes?
So they're no, from DOT's perspective, they're not a transit based organization. They don't think about public transit in any capacity. However, NFTA, I'm sure, has studied a lot of that. I will say that public transportation, particularly on the east side bus routes, is woefully inept, very slow, inconsistent, usually packed. And that needs to be addressed big time. I did a studio taking place at UB right now. It's a Hiro Hata's studio, and he's asking that they study the impacts of the cap in regards to possibly expanding the Science Museum. And a lot of those students, that's a combo architecture and planning studio, and many of them had proposed, expanding bus stop access, making larger bus stops, and placing them throughout that area to assist people to get to the Science Museum, which is one of the chief complaints of the Science Museum executives, is that it's so difficult to get to the Science Museum. There's no really way to park. You have to follow like throughway signs, and there just isn't really any public transit option, drop-off area or anything like that. So there are those investigating it, but the DOT is certainly not one of them.
You think about the history of like ownership of it? Like, was the park originally owned by the city, and then the state took it when they put the and then if they put the cap, does the cap stay under state ownership? Will it go back to the city? It'll go back to the city because the state doesn't care to maintain it, I don't think. Yeah. But the ownership of that land, I believe, I don't really know, to be honest with you. I know that the city owned it when it was part of the park system, and I don't know how. It'd be very interesting to see how that got handed over from the park system to the Thruway Authority, and how that transition happened. There was, I don't want to lay it solely on it being kind of a suburban intervention. There was a real thought that like this isn't how new cities are designed. They look at like Detroit
and they think they don't waste space with tree lined parkways that, you know, to Jim's point, that you don't see people in all the time. People need to get to work. We got to put a throughway here, just like Detroit has, just like Pittsburgh has. You know, that was the vogue thing then, just like a walkable and bikeable city concept is to us now.
Oh, Bidwell all the time.
What?
There's people on Bidwell all the time.
I think that, what?
It's almost there.
Right. I think, and then there's the pop-up markets and things like that. I think that the feeling is more like, I think it's partially racist. It's just like, you know, giving an African-American community public land to hang out at is seen as like a handout, in a way that a bunch of people hanging out on Bidwell is seen as like them using a park. You know, I was trying to find an artful way around saying it like that, but I think it's probably just better to call a spade at that point. I think that's a lot of the issue. And then, you know, I don't know how Bidwell and Chapin survived. I think that they're benefited a lot from the fact that most of the suburban expansion was east of Buffalo and not west, because there's a lake there and a river. But you know, the 198 was definitely a compromise for the north towns. Or I'm sorry, not the 198, the 190 going along all of our waterfront is obviously a compromise to the north towns. I think the 33 is kind of the compromise to the east towns. And the Skyway would be the south version of that.
In the presentation, I think a lot of what we discussed was community feedback, yay or nay. Has there been a lot of input from the suburbs, or is this seen as a city community problem, or is it, you know, or it has the transit, or has it been so poorly advertised or communicated that people out in the suburbs are maybe even more ignorant, like are maybe ignorant to what is even happening? Or being proposed to happen?
I don't really know if I know the answer to that. I will say that, you know, my uncle in Gettsville thinks it's dumb and doesn't want to do anything. Thinks that a parkway would be dumb, thinks that a cap would be dumb, doesn't want to spend any money on the east side, period. I think that, you know, I don't think that the suburbs are involved in this conversation, I guess would be the answer to your question. I think that this is sort of quintessentially New York State. A small group of people found some ears, some powerful ears that listened to them, and then it worked its way up. And, you know, the fact that Kathy Hochul is from Western New York, I think is a huge factor here. That's where her focus, her political focus is. And then, you know, the suburb thing, I don't know. I think the more that, like, I think that, like, we don't want to, at least on the east side, we don't want to pick a fight with the suburbs right now. I think that a lot of people would love that. Like, it, you know, it's a real, like, rallying call thing, but, like, we're going to lose. There's a lot more suburb people than there are east side people. And on top of that, they're the ones with the political power right now. They're the ones whose votes matter. We're in the pocket. We're going to vote Democrat every time. The suburbs are seen as the honey hole of politics right now.
I think the suburbs will care once they discover they've got to get off.
Yes.
Into the city streets for 5 years.
Right. Yeah. You're definitely right about that.
A little crazy.
Yep. And you know, you can extend that though to you know, getting rid of the 33 altogether.
Well, that's what will happen ultimately, Scott. So I don't mind spending so much time on this.
Yeah.
They're going to get used to being on the city streets. They won't even need the.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to love it. And you know, this idea that we're going to construct rapid transit, and that's going to get people to avoid cars enough so that they won't even need the throughway anymore. Well, like I love that idea. I think that rapid transit from Cheektowaga would solve the throughway problem, but you aren't going to convince anybody of that. And in order to convince anybody of that, you need a politician that thinks like the progressive sided people that I'm trying to get under control in order to be able to make this project as good as it can be, or happen at all. If there's somebody in Albany that thinks like we do, a cap isn't going to stop anybody from saying screw the suburbs. I'll say it right now, but it's not going to go anywhere. And you bring up the point of now going into city streets. I think that's much more a suburban perception thing than it is a reality thing. I think at the end of the day, an added 7-minute commute where you're not going 60 miles an hour is like a net stress down as opposed to, a huge inconvenience. I could take the 33 to work every day. It pretty much leads me directly from my home to my office. However, I take Main Street, even though the suspension of my car is woefully inept to do so, because my blood pressure can't handle it. I mean, it's like, I don't want to hop in rush hour traffic, with a bunch of people who are blitzing to clearance as fast as possible. Anybody else? Okay, guys, we did it. We solved it. Good job.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Scott.
Yep. Thanks to everybody online, and I will post a recording of this shortly. I will.
I want to have a giant scroll and be like,